Hey, it's Mark here, and welcome to the next edition of the Employee Survival Guide, where I tell you, as always, what your employer does definitely not want you to know about, and a lot more.
Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite the stack of legal documents here today.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. A complaint, a court decision, and a few news articles.
Okay.
All about a sexual harassment case at Yale.
Yale. Wow. You wouldn't think an Ivy League school would be caught up in something like this.
Right. And it's not just like a small thing either.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about 6 women doctors who accused this leading doctor, Manuel Lopes-Fontes, of serious sexual harassment.
Okay.
And they sued him, but also Yale University and Yale New Haven Hospital.
Wow.
Now, the case ended up settling out of court, but just the legal arguments themselves are fascinating.
I bet.
Plus, there's that whole human impact to think about how this affected everyone involved.
You know what I find interesting? This whole case basically hinged on whether or not Title IX.
Yeah.
You know, the law we usually think of with college sports applies to medical residents.
Okay, see, now that is where it gets really interesting because they're employees, but UT, they're also still in training. So it's kind of tricky.
Yeah, it's like a gray area.
And get this, while all these allegations were going on, Dr. Fontes was appointed vice chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Whoa. Talk about a head scratcher. It really makes you think about the disconnect between what an institution says they value and then how they actually act.
Absolutely.
Oh.
So let's start with who these women are, the plaintiffs, and why this case is so important. We're talking about Doctors Heidi Bools, Mia Castro, Ashley Eltorai, Jody Ann Oliver, Lori Ann Oliver, and Elizabeth Reinhardt.
Okay.
They all held various positions at Yale, some attending physicians, some residents or fellows.
And it's worth noting that the Oliver sisters are Black, right? So that adds another layer to
Oh, for sure. We're not just talking about gender here. It's the intersection of race and power, too.
Yeah.
All within academia.
Absolutely.
Now, these women didn't just like throw around some vague accusations.
Yeah.
They gave very specific and disturbing details. Inappropriate touching, unwanted kissing, sexualized comments, you name it.
Wow.
They even claimed that Dr. Fontes retaliated against some of them professionally.
So this wasn't just rumors going around.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The complaint lays out a pretty clear pattern to behavior that's hard to just dismiss.
Like what kind of specifics are we talking about?
Well, there's the allegation that Dr. Fontes forcibly kissed Dr. Bools at a cafe.
Oh, wow.
And another incident where he supposedly groped a resident at a graduation party.
That's awful.
One example that really got to me was Dr. Castro's claim that after she rejected Dr. Fontes' advances, he made her pick up a drop syringe cap instead of letting her help a patient.
Wait, what?
Yeah. We're talking about a critical medical situation where every second counts.
It's unbelievable.
It really highlights those power dynamics. You know?
Oh, absolutely. A resident trying to do her job in a high-pressure situation, and then she gets humiliated because she rejected her superior's advances.
Exactly. And the complaint doesn't just focus on Dr. Fontes either.
Really?
It paints Yale as an institution that has a history of protecting powerful men.
Oh, wow. So there's a pattern.
It seems that way. They point to past examples like Dr. Michael Simons. He was found to have sexually harassed a researcher, but he got to keep his leadership positions.
Oh, wow.
Then there's Dr. Eugene Richmond. He was reprimanded for inappropriate behavior with students back in 1994, but he was still allowed to bring students to his research facility in the Caribbean.
Seriously, they just let that go on.
Apparently.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the survey results that are cited in the complaint.
Right.
Yale seems to have much higher rates of sexual harassment compared to other universities.
That's disturbing.
It is. It makes you think maybe these elite schools care more about protecting their reputation than actually protecting the people who work and study there.
Yeah, I see your point. So this Title IX issue becomes even more interesting.
Oh, definitely.
Because Yale New Haven Hospital actually tried to say that Title IX didn't even apply to them.
Really?
Yeah, because they claimed it's meant for educational programs, not for employment.
Which is kind of convenient considering how closely tied the hospital is to the Yale Medical School.
Totally. But the judge didn't buy it.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, the judge pointed out that residents are both employees and students.
Right.
Plus, the hospital's own policies said employees should report harassment through Yale.
So that connection was pretty clear.
Oh, yeah. So it wasn't just a win for the plaintiffs. It set a precedent.
Oh, how so?
Well, it showed how Title IX protection can reach into the workplace.
Okay.
Especially in places like teaching hospitals that are closely linked to universities.
That's huge.
Yeah.
It seems like this case is just one small part of a much bigger issue.
Oh, absolutely. The debate over whether Title IX covers employees at schools is still happening in courts across the country.
So this is a really complex situation.
It is. It's like trying to figure out this giant puzzle.
Okay, so let's dig into those retaliation claims a little more.
Good idea. Retaliation can be tough to prove, but it's a real fear for anyone who reports harassment.
Absolutely. Dr. Elterai said she was banned from working in the ICU after reporting.
Wow.
And Dr. Castro claimed Dr. Fontes refused to support her application for a mission trip.
Oh, man.
Which could have messed up her fellowship.
That's awful. It shows the risks victims face even if they do speak up.
Right. It's so hard to prove intent, especially with subtle professional retaliation.
It is. And then there's that whole irony of Dr. Fontes being appointed vice chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion while this was all happening.
Yeah, I know. What do you make of that? Was Yale trying to cover things up? Or were they just clueless?
It's tough to say. It could have been a PR move.
Oh, you mean to look good?
Right. Try to show everyone they're committed to diversity, even though there's a scandal going on.
I could see that. But it definitely backfired.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It makes you wonder if maybe they were trying to sideline Dr. Fontes.
Oh, you mean like giving him a title to keep him busy with paperwork instead of patients?
Yeah, exactly. While the investigation was happening...
That's an interesting take.
It just shows how complicated things can get.
Right. Nothing's ever black and white in these situations.
Absolutely. There are so many layers to it all. Personal agendas, institutional politics. It's a lot to untangle.
So in the end, the case settled. But we don't know the terms because it's confidential.
Right.
We don't know if there was any financial compensation or anything. But what we do know is that 3 of the plaintiffs ended up leaving Yale.
Wow. That speaks volumes. Even with the settlement, their lives and careers were obviously affected.
It really makes you think about what justice looks like in these cases.
It does. So where did everyone end up after the settlement?
Well, Dr. Fontes' medical license is currently pending reinstatement.
Okay.
Dr. Elterai left Yale in 2022, and she's now an assistant professor at UConn School of Medicine.
Got it.
Dr. Reinhardt is teaching at the C.S. Mott Children's Hospital at the University of Michigan.
So they both moved on.
They did. It's almost like their paths diverged after this shared experience.
Yeah, some chose to start fresh somewhere else, and others stayed at Yale hoping to see things change from the inside.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And for those who stayed at Yale, Dr. Heidi Bulls is still an assistant professor of anesthesiology. And Dr. Jody Ann Oliver and Dr. Lori Ann Oliver are still working there as anesthesiologists as well.
So 3 out of the 6 stayed.
That's right. It's interesting to think about why they stayed.
Right. What would make them want to stay after everything that happened?
Yeah, maybe they saw some positive changes because of their lawsuit.
Maybe. Or maybe they felt a sense of duty to stay and push for change from within.
I could see that.
Or maybe it was just practical. You know, they'd built their careers at Yale.
Yeah.
Leaving would mean losing years of work and connections.
Probably a bit of everything.
Yeah, it's a tough call, but their choice to stay does suggest a glimmer of hope.
That things can get better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That even after going through something so awful, people can choose to stay and fight for what they believe in.
You know, before we move on, I wanted to mention something we talked about earlier.
Oh, yeah.
About Dr. Fontes being appointed vice chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion while all of this was going on.
Right. It was such a strange decision. How could they put someone accused of this kind of harassment in a position that's supposed to be about inclusivity and safety?
It did seem like a major PR blunder.
It was. It makes you question how serious Yale was about these allegations. Were they trying to sweep it all under the rug? Or was there something else going on?
Earlier, you were saying maybe they were trying to sideline Dr. Fontes.
Yeah. Maybe give him more paperwork to do and less patient contact while they investigated.
That's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
But even if that's true, it still looks really bad.
Oh, for sure. It just shows how institutions, even prestigious ones, can prioritize their own interests over the well-being of their people.
This case has definitely revealed some interesting legal wrinkles, especially with how Title IX applies.
Oh, yeah. Usually we think of Title IX in terms of college sports.
Right, making sure things are fair for men and women.
But this case kind of pushed the boundaries of that.
Totally. Remember how Yale New Haven Hospital said Title IX didn't apply to them?
Yeah, they said it's for educational programs, not for employment.
Right. But the judge disagreed.
Yeah, the judge said that the residency program is closely tied to the medical school.
So it was more than just an employment situation.
Exactly. The judge pointed out that residents are both employees, A&D students.
Makes sense.
And the hospital's own policies said to report harassment through Yale.
So that connection was pretty clear.
Oh, yeah. So this ruling was a win for the plaintiffs because it showed that Title IX can protect people in the workplace, too.
At least in places like teaching hospitals that are linked to universities.
Right. But this whole debate about whether Title IX covers employees at educational institutions is still ongoing.
Wow. So it's a really evolving area of the law.
It is. This case is just one small piece of a much bigger conversation about how to prevent and address harassment.
Okay, so we've talked about the accusations, the legal battle, the whole culture at Yale.
Right.
But we can't forget about the lasting impact on the plaintiffs and their careers.
You're so right. It's easy to get caught up in the legal stuff and forget that there are real people whose lives were affected.
Absolutely. 3 of them chose to leave Yale, and 3 decided to stay.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark difference. What do you think it says about their experiences?
I think it shows how different people cope with trauma and how they view the institution itself.
That's a good point. Maybe those who left felt like they needed a clean break.
Yeah, like leaving was the only way to truly move on.
Maybe they just didn't trust Yale to change.
And those who stayed, maybe they felt like they could be part of making things better.
Right, or maybe they had strong ties to Yale and leaving felt impossible.
Probably a mix of all those things.
It's a complex decision with no easy answers.
So we've covered a lot, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. We've still got a lot to unpack.
We do. And as we continue our deep dive, I hope we can go beyond just what happened.
Yeah.
And really explore the deeper questions, the big picture stuff that makes this case so important.
I'm with you. Let's take a closer look at some of the specific allegations against Dr. Fontes.
Okay.
What were some of the common themes that stood out to you?
Honestly, one of the first things I noticed was the variety of places where the alleged harassment happened. It wasn't just at the hospital or on campus.
You're right. We're talking about professional dinners, conferences, even a cafe meeting.
Yeah, it really shows how this behavior can creep into all sorts of situations that seem harmless at first.
It makes it so much harder for victims to figure out what's appropriate and what's not.
Especially when it's someone with authority.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like in Dr. Jody Ann Oliver's case, when she reported Dr. Fontes' inappropriate touching to the division chief, she was told he was just being handsy and affectionate because of his heritage.
Oh, wow. So they just dismissed it?
Basically.
Right.
They brushed it off as cultural differences.
That's so minimizing. It basically tells the victim that their feelings don't matter.
Exactly. And it protects the perpetrator.
And it perpetuates that culture where harassment is just accepted.
Right. It makes you wonder if the division chief really believed that, or if they were just trying to avoid dealing with the problem.
It's a good question. And it points to how even subtle forms of complicity can create a really harmful environment.
Let's take a quick break.
Hey, it's Mark, and we have a new product for you. It's called the Employee Survival Guide, or employeesurvival.com, and it's a site that you can obtain PDF products that I created myself. It's spending too many hours, way too many, researching and writing about, if, for example, the performance improvement plan or beating them, and the second one about negotiating severance negotiation agreements, two of the most important topics that we see in terms of the web traffic and podcast traffic we have. So check out employeesurvival.com and see if this can try to help you, and you don't need an attorney to use it. Thank you.
So the complaint outlines this pattern of escalation in Dr. Fontes' behavior.
Okay.
It starts with inappropriate comments, then moves to unwanted touching, and eventually leads to forced kissing and groping.
Yeah, that's not just being handsy anymore. That's crossing a serious line.
Right. It's a violation of personal boundaries and a clear abuse of power.
Absolutely.
For example, the complaint says Dr. Fontes groped a resident at a graduation party.
Oh, God.
He forcibly kissed Dr. Bowles at a cafe, and he even forced his tongue down Dr. Larry Ann Oliver's throat at a dinner where he'd already forcibly kissed her sister, Dr. Jody Ann Oliver.
That's awful. And the fact that some of this supposedly happened in public places with people around is just unbelievable.
It does make you wonder why no one intervened.
Right. Were they afraid to say something? Did they not realize how serious it was?
Or was there just this culture of silence where everyone looked the other way?
It's hard to say without knowing more about those specific situations.
Oh.
But it does show how complicated these dynamics can be.
There are so many things that can contribute to a culture of harassment.
Yeah, like fear of retaliation or feeling loyal to the person or just not wanting to get involved in something that makes you uncomfortable.
So let's talk about the alleged retaliation that some of the plaintiffs experienced after reporting.
Okay, retaliation can be really insidious. It can be anything from subtle snubs to being excluded from opportunities or even getting demoted or fired.
In this case, Dr. Elterai claimed she was banned from working in the ICU.
Wow.
And Dr. Castro said Dr. Fontes wouldn't support her application for a mission trip.
Which could have hurt her fellowship.
Exactly. These are serious allegations.
They are. Imagine being a resident already in such a vulnerable position and then facing consequences like that for speaking up. It sends such a terrible message to other victims.
It's like they're being punished for doing the right thing.
And that's a big reason why so many people stay silent.
They're afraid of the consequences.
Right. And then there's the whole thing with Yale appointing Dr. Fontes as vice chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion while all this was going on.
I know. It's mind-boggling. What were they thinking?
It's hard to say. It just seems so tone-deaf to appoint someone accused of sexual harassment to the position that's supposed to be about creating a safe and inclusive environment.
It does make you question their judgment.
Totally. But maybe they were trying to manage the situation internally.
You mean like give him a different role to minimize the damage?
Right. Maybe they thought they could control the situation better if he was in a more administrative role.
That's an interesting theory. But it definitely didn't look good from the outside.
Oh, no, not at all. It just adds to the whole perception that they were more concerned with protecting their reputation than addressing the problem.
This case has also brought up some really interesting legal points about how Title IX is applied.
Yeah, we usually think of Title IX in terms of college sports and making sure men and women have equal opportunities.
Right.
But this case really pushed the boundaries of that.
Remember, Yale New Haven Hospital tried to argue that they weren't subject to Title IX. Because it's meant for educational programs, not employment.
Yeah, they were basically saying that medical residents are primarily employees, not students.
Which is a clever argument, considering they're kind of both.
Totally. But the judge didn't buy it.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. The judge emphasized how closely connected the residency program is to the medical school.
So it was more than just a simple employment situation.
Right. It was about the educational aspect, too. The judge even pointed out that the hospital's own policies said to report harassment through Yale.
So the lines were blurred.
For sure. And that's what makes this ruling so significant. It expands the reach of Title IX protections into the workplace, at least in settings that are closely tied to educational institutions.
That's a big deal. It feels like we're witnessing a shift in how these laws are being interpreted.
We are. It's all about adapting to these changing workplace dynamics.
Okay, so to wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are your main takeaways so far? What stands out to you?
Honestly, what gets me is how much courage it took for these plaintiffs to come forward. They knew they were risking their careers, their reputations, everything.
It's true. They were going up against a powerful institution and a powerful man.
Exactly. And that's why this case is so important. It shows that even in the face of immense pressure, people can still choose to speak truth to power.
And it highlights how crucial it is to support survivors of harassment. We need to create a culture where people feel safe coming forward, knowing they'll be believed and supported.
Absolutely. We need to move beyond just acknowledging the problem and start actively working towards solutions.
That means holding institutions accountable for creating a safe and equitable environment.
Exactly. And that includes having clear policies against harassment, investigating complaints thoroughly, and taking real action against those who are responsible.
This first part of our deep dive has been a real eye-opener.
It has. We've seen how power dynamics can be abused even in institutions that are supposed to be dedicated to knowledge and progress.
It's a reminder that harassment can happen anywhere, and that it takes all of us to create a culture of respect and accountability.
Couldn't agree more. Picking up where we left off last time, let's think about what happened after the settlement.
Okay.
Remember, 3 of those women decided to leave Yale altogether.
It makes you wonder, what was it about the environment there that made leaving seem like the only option?
Yeah, did they just not believe anything would actually change?
It's possible maybe they felt disillusioned by the whole process.
Yeah, even with the settlement, maybe they felt like justice hadn't really been served.
Right, or that Yale wouldn't really commit to changing things.
Yeah, it must have been a tough decision for them. They were successful doctors with established careers at a prestigious institution.
Absolutely. Starting over somewhere new is never easy.
It really shows how deeply these experiences can affect you, both professionally and personally.
For sure. Sometimes you need a fresh start just to heal and rebuild.
Exactly.
So specifically, Dr. Elterai, she's now an assistant professor at UConn School of Medicine. She left Yale back in 2022, right in the middle of all of this.
It's a good reminder that these legal cases can drag on for years.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine trying to focus on your career, your patients, your research, with this whole thing hanging over you.
It's got to be incredibly stressful.
It is. Being a doctor is hard enough without all that added pressure.
Dr. Reinhardt also moved on. She's teaching at the C.S. Mott Children's Hospital at the University of Michigan now.
Okay.
Michigan's a great school, too.
Yeah.
It seems like both Dr. Ulterai and Dr. Reinhardt landed on their feet.
Yeah, they did. They're both talented doctors and clearly resilient.
But we can't forget about the emotional toll this must have taken.
Oh, of course not. Even if they're doing well in their new jobs, they still had to uproot their lives, leave behind colleagues and friends, and start over.
It's a huge change. So what about the plaintiffs who stayed at Yale? What was their experience like?
Yeah, did they see any real changes after the settlement?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Right.
It's hard to know what happened behind the scenes. We do know that Dr. Heidi Bools is still an assistant professor of anesthesiology there.
Okay.
And Dr. Jodianne Oliver and Dr. Lorianne Oliver, they're also still working as anesthesiologists at Yale.
So 3 out of the 6 original plaintiffs are still there?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about.
It is. What do you think it means?
Maybe they saw some positive changes happen at Yale because of the lawsuit.
That's possible. Or maybe they just felt like they had a responsibility to stay and advocate for change from within.
Yeah, maybe they felt like leaving wouldn't solve anything.
Could also be a practical thing, you know? They'd built their careers at Yale.
Right.
Leaving would mean giving up a lot.
It's probably a mix of all those factors.
Probably. But choosing to stay suggests a certain amount of hope, you know? Like they believed things could get better.
You know, I keep thinking about that whole thing with Dr. Fontes being appointed vice chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion while these allegations were still pending.
Oh, yeah, that was bizarre. How do you even make sense of that?
I know. It's like they completely missed the point.
Like, how can someone accused of such serious harassment be put in charge of promoting inclusivity and safety? It just doesn't add up.
It was a PR disaster waiting to happen.
It was. It really makes you question what Yale was thinking. Were they just trying to sweep it all under the rug or what?
I remember you saying earlier that maybe it was a way to sideline Dr. Fontes.
Yeah, maybe give him a different role so he wasn't interacting with patients as much while they were investigating.
Yeah, that's possible. But even if that's true, it still looks really bad.
Oh, totally. It just reinforces this idea that they cared more about protecting their own image than addressing the problem.
Let's talk about the legal side of this for a minute, especially that whole debate about Title IX.
Okay, yeah, that was a big part of the case. Remember how Yale New Haven Hospital tried to argue that Title IX didn't even apply to them?
Yeah, they said it's meant for educational programs, not employment.
Exactly. And since medical residents are employees of the hospital, they claimed they were exempt.
It was a clever argument. I'll give them that. Yeah. It really highlighted that gray area between education and employment.
Yeah, especially in a teaching hospital where residents are kind of both students and employees.
Right, but the judge didn't agree.
No, the judge said that the residency program is too closely tied to the medical school to make that distinction.
The judge's reasoning was really interesting.
It was. They basically said that residents are both employees and students, and that the hospital's own policies directed employees to report harassment through Yale.
So there was no separating the two.
Exactly. And that's what makes this ruling so important. It shows that Title IX can protect people in the workplace, too.
Especially in settings that are closely connected to educational institutions.
Right. But it's important to remember that this whole issue of whether Title IX applies to employees at schools is still being debated in courts all over the country.
So this case is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
It is, and it shows how the law is constantly trying to catch up with changing social norms and workplace dynamics.
Let's zoom out a bit and think about the bigger picture. What does this case tell us about the culture of harassment in academia in general?
That's a good question. We tend to think of universities as these places of higher learning where things like harassment wouldn't happen.
Right, like they're supposed to be above that.
Exactly. But as we've seen, even the most prestigious schools can have a culture of silence where harassment is allowed to thrive.
And it's not just Yale. The complaint mentioned other examples of alleged harassment there.
Oh, right, like the cases of Dr. Michael Simons and Dr. Eugene Richmond.
Yeah, they were both found to have engaged in harassment, but they were basically protected by the institution.
And then there's the survey data that shows higher rates of harassment at Yale compared to other universities.
Right. It makes you wonder if Yale was really committed to addressing the problem or if they were more concerned with protecting their reputation and the powerful people within the institution.
It's a tough question, but it's an important one. We need to hold institutions accountable for creating a safe environment for everyone.
Absolutely. This deep dive has really highlighted how institutions handle or sometimes mishandle these sensitive issues.
It has. So before we move on, what are some of the key takeaways you'd like to emphasize?
I think one of the biggest lessons here is the importance of speaking up. If you see something wrong, you have to say something.
Oh, absolutely. It's not always easy, especially if you're worried about retaliation or causing trouble.
But staying silent only protects the people who are doing the harassing.
Exactly. We need to create a culture where victims feel safe coming forward and where bystanders feel empowered to intervene.
I also think this case shows the need for more transparency and accountability within institutions. Confidential settlements might be the norm, but they can also shield institutions from real scrutiny.
That's true. On the one hand, you want to protect the privacy of the individuals involved.
Right.
But on the other hand, that secrecy can make it hard to know if any real changes are being made.
And it can create the impression that institutions are more concerned with protecting their own reputation than with truly addressing the problem.
It's a tough balance to strike. This whole deep dive has been really thought-provoking.
It has. It's made me think about how complex this issue of sexual harassment is and how much work we still have to do to create a truly just and equitable society.
Couldn't agree more. So what are some of the big questions we should be asking ourselves as we move forward?
Well, I think one of the most important questions is how do we create a culture where victims feel safe speaking up?
Yeah, knowing that they'll be believed and supported and not punished for coming forward.
It's about building trust and creating an environment where everyone feels respected.
Exactly. And it's about holding institutions accountable, making sure they have clear policies against harassment and that they actually enforce them.
And providing resources and support for victims.
Absolutely. We need to move beyond just talking about the problem and actually start implementing real solutions.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive.
We have. We've looked at what happened after the settlement, the impact on the plaintiffs, the legal arguments, the bigger picture of harassment in academia.
But there's one piece of the puzzle we haven't talked about yet.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
What about Dr. Fontes? What happened to him?
You're right. We've talked about the women who came forward, but what about the man who was accused?
Is he back practicing medicine? Did he face any consequences beyond the lawsuit?
These are important questions. We need to know what happened to him to fully understand the scope of this case.
So let's shift our focus to Dr. Fontes in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready to find out what happened to him.
Join us for the final part as we wrap up this complex case and explore what it all means for the fight against sexual harassment.
Okay, so we've talked about the plaintiffs, the allegations against Dr. Fontes, the legal battles, and the culture at Yale, BUT. What about Dr. Fontes himself?
Right, we've discussed the impact on the women, but what about consequences for him, the accused?
Yeah. Good point. According to those news articles, his medical license was still pending reinstatement as of 2021.
So 4 years after the lawsuit was filed.
Exactly. It's a long time to be in limbo professionally. It is. Makes you wonder what that process was like for him and what the medical board was looking for, to decide if he could practice again.
It's interesting. The articles don't really say if there were any restrictions or conditions attached to his license.
Oh, so we don't know if he had to do extra training or evaluations or anything like that?
Right. It's possible all those details are confidential.
Ah, that makes sense.
Which brings us back to that whole issue of transparency.
Yeah.
On one hand, you want to protect people's privacy, but on the other hand, this lack of information is frustrating.
Especially for those who want to see accountability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a tough balance.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of something we've talked about a lot in this deep dive.
What's that?
That tension between protecting individuals and making sure institutions are transparent.
Right. And we saw that with the confidential settlement, too.
Yeah, it's common practice, but it can feel like it shields institutions from having to answer for their actions.
It makes it harder to know if they actually made any changes to prevent this from happening again.
Something that really stuck with me from the complaint was how they compared this case to other instances of alleged harassment at Yale.
Oh, yeah. You mean the cases with Dr. Michael Simons and Dr. Eugene Richmond?
Those are the ones.
Yeah.
It makes it seem like Yale has this pattern of protecting powerful men even when they've been accused of harassment.
It's hard to ignore that pattern, especially with those survey results showing higher rates of sexual harassment at Yale.
Right. It makes you wonder if this was just a few bad apples or if there's a deeper problem, a culture that allows this to happen.
That's the big question, is it? And it's something we see in institutions all over the place, not just at Yale.
It feels like there's a reluctance to really dig into the root causes of harassment.
Yeah, maybe because it would mean changing some pretty entrenched power structures.
It's easier to focus on individual bad actors than to address the system itself.
So much easier. So what are some of the big takeaways from this whole deep dive into the case at Yale? What have we learned about the fight against sexual harassment?
I think one of the most important lessons is the power of collective action. These plaintiffs might not have accomplished as much if they hadn't come together.
Right. There's strength in numbers.
Absolutely. And it sends a message that this behavior won't be tolerated.
And it also highlights how important it is to support survivors. These women face so much pressure for coming forward.
They were incredibly brave.
They were. They needed a lot of support to get through all of that.
And that support can come from so many places: colleagues, friends, family advocacy groups, lawyers. It takes a village.
You're so right. I think another key takeaway is that institutions need to be held accountable.
Yeah, it's not enough to just have policies on paper.
No, they need to actually enforce those policies, investigate complaints thoroughly, and take action against people who engage in harassment.
And not just a slap on the wrist either. The consequences need to fit the offense.
Exactly. It has to send a message that this behavior won't be tolerated.
We also can't forget about the role of witnesses.
Oh, that's so important.
We all have a responsibility to speak up if we see something wrong.
Whether it's challenging inappropriate behavior or supporting someone who's been harassed, we can't just stand by and do nothing.
Silence only makes the problem worse.
Wow, this deep dive has been quite a journey.
It has. We started with these legal documents and ended up exploring power dynamics, institutional culture, and the really personal stories at the heart of this case.
It's been eye-opening for sure. It's clear that even prestigious institutions can be part of the problem.
And that seeking justice can be a long and complicated process.
It is. But we've also seen the courage of the women who came forward and the impact they had on Yale and hopefully on the wider conversation about harassment.
I hope this deep dive has encouraged everyone listening to think critically about these issues and to consider how they can help create a more just and equitable world.
Me too. Whether it's speaking up, supporting survivors, or advocating for change, we all have a role to play.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.
If you like the Employee Survival Guide, I'd really encourage you to leave a review. We try really hard to produce information to you that's informative, that's timely, that you can actually use and solve problems on your own and at your employment. So if you like to leave a review anywhere you listen to our podcast, please do so. And leave 5 stars, because anything less than 5 is really not as good, right? I'll keep it up. I'll keep the standards up. I'll keep the information flowing at you. If you'd like to send me an email and ask me a question, I'll actually review it and post it on there. You can send it to mcarui@capclaw.com. That's capclaw.com.